Blog Talk Radio.
This is BR on the World, Boston Red here on the second day of March 2014. We've been a little bit remiss in broadcasting our international version of the political cast Boston Red is done in the U.S. and, of course, can be heard worldwide. But the various machinations in the Ukraine, starting with the overthrow of the legitimate president, something the Western media does not mention. He was overthrown by fascist forces in the Ukraine. Those forces have been on the move across the Ukraine for some time. There are various actors there, many of them sponsored by the West. There was a move by the EU to incorporate the Ukraine closer to the EU to get that strategic position on the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation has its own, obviously, self-interest in this particular matter, and in the area where they are at the present time, down in the Crimea, that is an area that is composed of a large sector of Russian retirees. It's a nice area to be in, one of a few places in the old Soviet Union you could go for holiday and be in the sun. Now the temps there are better than in many parts of North America. I'm thinking of Missoula, Montana, Billings, that area across the Midwest, Chicago, and we've had very frigid temperatures on and off on the East Coast. But nonetheless, that area is there. V.I. Putin made a statement and was asked by the new installed government there, nothing new, to up the levels of Russian Federation troops, and now they have panned out across the Crimea, taking on various fascist gangs. So far, there's been no report of bloodshed in that particular area. Now, as far as other parts of the Ukraine, there are forces there. It's not a stable situation, either politically or economically. There is broadcast to the West by that outlaw operation of bandits that's now in control of the Ukraine. How much support they have, we really don't know. That is the quote-unquote, as we would say around here, the skinny. But it will start to unfold. You'll hear, when we leave, some comments by the Minister of Defense, the one John Kerry, a man that ran for president against G.W. Dummy Bush, a former president and warmonger. Kerry, in a typical Cold War mode, but in a better mode than that, talked about the repercussions of this on the Russian Federation. He basically, as we say again, talked down to the actions of President Putin and what some of the consequences could be. The G8 expansion into the G7, I should say, expansion into the G8, they are taking that off the table. They were supposed to meet in the resort of Sochi in the summer. That perhaps will not go off, but the other implications in the economic sphere should be a wake-up call. I saw someone else writing about that. I think it was the peace campaigner Kathleen Raleigh, the FBI whistleblower that was in the center of the World Trade case, or one of her colleagues. But nonetheless, if sanctions can be had on the Russian Republic by the U.S. and its cronies in Europe that seize your bank accounts, not favorable trade, etc., just means where the West's economic power is. If they have the power to, say, seize a bank account of a V.I. Putin, if he had one in the U.S., or if he had one in London, or wherever he had one out of the Russian Republic and various other places. That shows how tenuous the situation is. And it's a slave-master situation, and they need to do something about it. There's no doubt in our minds there, to make it a much more equitable situation. A slave cannot be equal to, quote-unquote, his master, and in this case, they set themselves up as the economic master. They've tried this in emerging markets. They did it to Dr. Gaddafi before they assassinated him or killed him. They did it in Egypt to Hosni Mubarak, Mohammed Hosni Mubarak. They did it in Syria. So if they can use this vast economic club, now this and doing it also in the Islamic Republic of Iran, to seize assets of the Iranian nation through the Treasury Department and through various pinnacles in Europe. This just means that those nations do not have the economic wherewithal at this time to stand on their 2 feet, so to speak. So that has to be corrected. Now, the Russian Federation has seeked and organizing economic ties with, say, India, 1 billion people. They need to have better ties with China, another 1 billion people. And in the Americas with Brazil and various other nations, they need to push this and follow the plans that they used to follow in the old Soviet Union, but it has to be much more substantial. Now, what could the Russian Federation do about the economic sanctions? Well, if they have money in banks, they could seize that. As far as B2B relationships in the old Soviet Union or in the Russian Republic, for so-called European or American businesses, well, those assets would be very, very tenuous in this situation. As far as the U.S. is concerned, very few Russian Federation products come into the U.S. More U.S. products flow there. So that would hurt American business and not necessarily Russian Federation business. Now, as far as the Europeans, they sell petroleum product to them. If they decide to buy elsewhere, they could obviously do that. But in the long term and in the short term, the Putin government, for lack of a better term, needs to look to be much more self-sufficient and look at the deck of cards that Minister Kerry dealt out today to be tough in a Cold War manner. So this is basically connecting the dots here. Where will this go? It will obviously depend on the bandits in the Ukraine. If Russian people or Russian interests are at risk, the Americans and Europeans can be assured V.I. Putin will do what is needed. As far as the consequences of it, unless they assume that President Putin and his general staff are ninnies, they understand what these people can do to them. Period. So on we go, and we'll be back with much more regular reports. We have a little clip now from the CBS News, and also a very interesting little clip from the General Secretary, Nikita Khrushchev. He gave the first TV interview to the CBS News. That is the first network TV interview he had given to the U.S. and to the people of the Soviet Union. There was talk at that time of a government control of network news. But what that interview did was put television, a new entity at the time in the 50s, on equal footing with newspapers and with radio. This is Boston Red, the Boston Red family. We'll be on with something we call the Monday Morning Quarterback, which is a hybrid sports program, and various other programs throughout the week. You can check us out on Facebook as Boston Red, on Twitter as Boston Red also, and on the RSS feed. Good day.
This is in Crimea. Ukrainians call up their military reserves and beg the international community for help.
We are on the brink of the disaster.
We'll go to Ukraine for the latest news. We'll hear from Secretary of State John Kerry and Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. We'll have analysis on all of it from a panel of experts, and with Russia once more in the news, we'll look back at a milestone Face the Nation interview. 60 years of news, because this is Face the Nation. morning again. Well, there are developments from overnight on the crisis in Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin has moved troops into Crimea. That is a region with a mostly Russian-speaking population, a move that the Ukrainian Prime Minister says is a declaration of war. Vladimir Putin and President Obama spoke yesterday for 90 minutes, a conversation the White House described as the toughest of the Obama presidency. As for Ukraine, a new government there is mobilizing its reserves and authorizing the call-up of all men under the age of 40. CBS News correspondent Charlie D'Agata is in Kiev this morning. Charlie, people are again out in the square. What's going on there?
Yeah, Bob, there are about 1,000 in Crimea. Today we've been hearing them saying, down with Russian President Vladimir Putin. They're calling him a liar and a dictator. The Ukrainian Prime Minister said that the country is on the brink of disaster and they're preparing for war. And the way they've done that is they put the standing military, 130,000 people or so, on high alert. But they've also put the call out to reserves using websites and radio, saying to stand by for further information and instruction. They may have to go to military centers around Kiev and around Ukraine and report for duty, fighting men under 40 years old. Now, we haven't seen, it doesn't feel like this area itself is under threat. There's no military presence at the airport or around the squares or on the roads. But the real concern is around the eastern border, along the border with Russia, where you have a lot of Russian-speaking people, a lot of Russian loyalties. And the concern is whether Russian troops will advance in those areas, and more importantly, what Ukrainian forces can do, if anything, to defend against that.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. CBS News foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer is in southern Ukraine this morning, and she is en route to the Crimea region. Liz, what's the latest?
Thousands of Russian troops are fanning out over the Crimean Peninsula, taking control. They're uniformed, and they are setting up at strategic locations. Many of them were based in the Crimea anyway, with the Russian Black Sea Fleet on a lease agreement with the Ukraine. Well, they've left the bases and they're out on active duty. Also, it appears that some hundreds of soldiers have been brought in from elsewhere in Russia. Now, not a shot has been fired. This has been very peaceful. In fact, a lot of the people, Russian-speaking, pro-Russian population of Crimea, have welcomed those troops. And their mission, which, according to Vladimir Putin, is to protect the Russian-speaking population.
And I understand you've had quite an eventful trip en route to the Crimea.
That's right, Bob. We drove a long way from Kiev and finally got to this rather informal border across the neck that leads onto the Crimean Peninsula. And there was a barricade in the road manned by what we thought were Ukrainian troops. Well, it turns out these guys had switched sides. They'd hoisted the Russian flag at their barricade, and they were backed up by a group of local men in camouflage gear, also armed, who came and raided our truck, took our gear apart, and stole our body armor. Not only did they steal it, they put it on right away, helmets and flak jackets, walked off with it and told us to get out of there, that they weren't going to let us in.
Okay, well, be careful for the rest of the trip, Liz, and we'll check in with you later today. We are joined now by Secretary of State John Kerry, who is in Boston this morning. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. The Ukrainian Prime Minister says this morning that Russia's actions amount to a declaration of war, and he says we are on the brink of disaster. Do you agree with that?
Well, it's an incredible act of aggression. It is really a stunning, willful choice by President Putin to invade another country. Russia is in violation of the sovereignty of Ukraine. Russia is in violation of its international obligations. Russia is in violation of its obligations under the UN Charter, under the Helsinki Final Act. It's a violation of its obligations under the 1994 Budapest Agreement. You just don't, in the 21st century, behave in 19th century fashion by invading another country on completely trumped-up pretext. So it is a very serious moment, but it's serious not in the context, Bob, of Russia, U.S. It's serious in terms of sort of the modern manner with which nations are going to resolve problems. There are all kinds of other options still available to Russia. There still are. President Obama wants to emphasize to the Russians that there is a right set of choices that can still be made to address any concerns they have about Crimea, about their citizens, but you don't choose to invade a country in order to do that.
The president spoke to Vladimir Putin, we're told, for 90 minutes yesterday. The White House is describing it as the toughest phone call of his presidency. Do you think it had any impact?
Well, we're going to have to wait and see, but I think it was a very important conversation. The president was very strong. He made absolutely clear that this was unacceptable and that there will be serious repercussions if this stands. The president asked Mr. Putin, in fact, told Mr. Putin it was imperative to find a different path, to roll back this invasion and undo this act of aggression. He pointed out the many different ways in which Russia could have chosen to act. I mean, if you have legitimate concerns about your citizens, go to the United Nations, ask for observers, engage the other country's government. There were any number of choices available to Russia. Russia chose this brazen act of aggression and moved in with its forces on a completely trumped up set of a pretext, claiming that people were threatened. And the fact is that that's not the act of somebody who is strong. That's the act of somebody who is acting out of weakness and out of certain kind of desperation. We hope that Russia will turn this around. They can. Again and again, all week, President Obama and I and others have insisted that we believe there's a way to deal with this issue. This doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It is not Russia versus the United States, Russia v. Europe. This is about the people of Ukraine. The people of Ukraine are the people who initiated what is happening there. Their president, Yanukovych, supported by Russia, lost all support, all legitimacy. He fled in the night. His own supporters deserted him. They went to their parliament and they voted according to their parliamentary process. So this is a democratic process that has placed this new government where it is, and President Putin and Russia ought to respect that.
Mr. Secretary, when you come right down to it, the president says there's a cost, and I suppose there are certain diplomatic things you could do. You could boycott the G8 and so on. But when you come right down to it, what can we really do here? I mean, I don't suppose anybody thinks we're going to declare war on Russia here and send military forces in there.
Well, there are very serious repercussions that can flow out of this. There are a broad array of options that are available, not just to the United States, but to our allies. I spent yesterday afternoon on the phone with many of my counterparts. I talked to 10 of the foreign ministers of those countries most engaged, the G8 plus some others, and all of them, every single one of them, are prepared to go to the hilt in order to isolate Russia with respect to this invasion. They're prepared to put sanctions in place. They're prepared to isolate Russia economically. The ruble is already going down. Russia has major economic challenges. I can't imagine that an occupation of another country is something that appeals to people who are trying to reach out to the world. And particularly if it involves violence, I think they're going to be inviting major difficulties for the long term. The people of Ukraine will not sit still for this. They know how to fight. They've demonstrated remarkable bravery, Bob. I mean, you think about Yanukovych positioning his snipers on the rooftops of Kiev, and notwithstanding people falling to the right and to the left, these marchers kept on marching, and they demanded their freedom. They demanded their opportunity to have their voices heard without a kleptocracy and a tyranny governing them. I think Russia needs to think very carefully about the choice that it's making, and there are visa bans, there are asset freezes, there is isolation with respect to trade and investment. American businesses may well want to start thinking twice about whether they want to do business with a country that behaves like this. These are serious implications. And I know from my conversations yesterday, every one of our allies and friends are determined to stay united and to make clear there is a price attached to this kind of behavior.
Are we actually prepared, Mr. Secretary, to boycott the G8 meeting there?
Well, we're absolutely prepared to if we can't resolve it otherwise. But the preference of the President, myself, the entire administration, is to resolve this. We're not trying to make this a battle between East and West. We don't want to return to the Cold War. Nobody wants this kind of action. There are many ways to resolve
this could be a very dangerous situation if this continues in a very provocative way. We have many options, like any nation's.
Considerable reporting yesterday on the president's phone call to Putin. You said officials were telling you this was the toughest phone call of his administration. What are they thinking about over there this morning? What do they see as what might happen here?
Well, Bob, the White House knows that Putin has the facts on the ground. He has a military force in the Crimea. What the United States and its European partners have is international law, international norms, and the threat of pronounced economic isolation for Russia if it continues with what Secretary of State Kerry just called a brazen breach of international law. Now, the reason the administration uses that phraseology is because that's what Vladimir Putin conspicuously and constantly talks about in other parts of the world. Syria, Iran, it's always talking about other nations, specifically the United States, following international norms. Well, the United States is now calling Russia out on its behavior, saying you're violating the self-same standards you constantly seek to hold the rest of the world to. And if you continue with this behavior, you're going to be isolated not only diplomatically, but economically. And right now the administration is working behind the scenes to have this IMF team, International Monetary Fund team, that's due to arrive in Kiev later this week, not just come there to say hello, but have a specific aid package for the Ukrainians to say the West is here to help you economically. And as it has with the situation in Crimea, the administration will invite the Russians in. Look, participate internationally if you have legitimate concerns about the Russians in Crimea. But if you don't, your isolation, economically and diplomatically, will only increase, and the White House believes that is a greater force of leverage than they believe Putin has, even though he has the forces on the ground in Crimea.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Major. David, what's happening militarily? I don't think anybody, as I said to Secretary Kerry, and he didn't dispute this, nobody's saying about going to war with Russia right now. Is there any kind of military movement in that part of the world right now? Ships or anything like that?
Not on the part of the United States. The only movement right now is Russian troops continue to flow into Crimea. It's hard to put a number on it, but whatever the number, it's a fait accompli. And you notice that Secretary Kerry said, if this stands. He did not say, this shall not stand, as George H.W. Bush once said of the invasion of Kuwait. The U.S. has no military options. It has no treaty obligations to come to the defense of Ukraine. Putin knows that, and that is why he has acted so decisively. The big question is whether he is going to order Russian troops into the rest of Ukraine. That would turn what is now a crisis into, I think, a full-scale
Well,
disaster.
explain to us exactly what's happened here. The Russians have a base. They have a military base in Crimea. There are Russian troops there already. Apparently, some of them have moved outside of the base now, but they haven't moved beyond the borders of Crimea.
That's right. They haven't crossed over where Liz Palmer was standing into the rest of Ukraine. And this morning's intelligence is that there is no sign that they are preparing to do that, which is, in the context of everything else that's happened, very good news.
So, David, how do you assess what's happened so far, and what happens now?
Well, I think we saw the parameters of U.S. policy in the interviews with Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel. Secretary Kerry used very strong language, brazen act of aggression, violation of international law. He called on the Russians to roll back this invasion. But when you got down to the specific tools, the ways in which the United States will make Russia pay a cost for what it's done, these are milder diplomatic options. As David said, I'm told by my sources in the Pentagon, there is no ship moving in the Mediterranean. There are no NATO troops moving on the landmass of Europe. We are not preparing for a military response. If you're talking about rollback, you're talking about Putin realizing that this course, which reanimates Cold War psychology in Eastern Europe, is not in his interest. And I do think that the final point to add here is the real problem today is Vladimir Putin's. Vladimir Putin has a Ukraine that is coming apart. He has invaded a small southern piece of it where Russian interests are very strong. But in the Ukrainian capital, you have demonstrators in the streets. These are demonstrators who evicted a pro-Russian regime in Ukraine, and they're not prepared to go backwards. So the choices Putin faces going forward are very, very bad.
Well, explain to me about the Crimea. It is a part of Ukraine, but someone said to me last night, it's very much like San Diego. You have a large retired military population there, mostly Russians. A lot of the people there speak Russian, and most of the people there are pro-Russian. You heard Liz Palmer say that a lot of these soldiers changed sides here.
Crimea became part of Ukraine only in 1954. Crimea was historically a part of Russia, and Khrushchev, when he was the Soviet leader, gave it to Ukraine in a gesture that mystified some people. But what you say is true. I don't know if it's San Diego, but it is where the Russians have their biggest naval base, where a lot of retirees go. People speak Russian.
It has gotten more attention over the last half century than America's relationship with Russia. In fact, it was that story that produced Face the Nation's biggest and most controversial scoop.
Face the Nation. Through the eyes of CBS News film cameras located for the first time inside these walls of the Kremlin on Red Square in Moscow.
It was June 2nd, 1957, and Face the Nation was going to make history. After 2 years of dead-end negotiations, producers had managed to book the very first television interview with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev.
Mr. Khrushchev, we're very grateful to you for allowing us to come here. We have many questions that we want to put to you through your interpreter, and I'm very sure that you must have many answers to give us, which will be of great interest to millions of Americans.
Most of those answers proved unremarkable, but what made front pages around the world was the simple fact that Khrushchev, who had never been seen doing an interview by his own people, had been seen and heard in America's living rooms.
I can prophesy that your grandchildren in America will live under socialism.
With Cold War tensions running high, some government officials accused CBS of putting out communist propaganda. Secretary of State Dulles refused to watch the interview. Even President Eisenhower, a staunch internationalist, suggested it was a phony exercise.
We know that there are no prepared questions here and no prepared answers. It is a matter of trying to deal honestly with each other and then putting it on in the papers and on the radio and in the on the television screen. And this other performance last Sunday afternoon was far from that.
Some in Congress even call for laws to keep foreign leaders off television unless the government gave permission. But CBS President Frank Stanton stood by the interview, and it came to be hailed as a journalistic milestone, establishing that broadcasters had the same right as newspapers to report the news without government interference.